You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. Alan Bern is a renowned composer, pianist, accordionist, educator, and cultural activist who has been internationally recognized for his preservation and promotion of klezmer music in Winnipeg as part of a 2-week musician in residence program at the University of Manitoba. Alan has joined me in studio along with Associate Dean des Hôtels Faculty of Music undergraduate programs Laura Lowen. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Alan, what did we just hear?
We just heard a Dobry Den, which is a genre of music, of Yiddish music, played by klezmorim in Eastern Europe, and it was a piece to start the day. I think your Ukrainian speakers listening to the radio will recognize that term. Dobry Den means a good morning.
A very good morning to you. Dobry Den indeed. Alan, can we talk a little bit more about klezmer music to begin, which I know is a broad term, but for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the term klezmer, can you summarize and contextualize for us?
Yes. Well, originally, klezmer referred to a professional musician in Yiddish culture. And it wasn't until the 20th century that people began speaking of klezmer music. Originally, music of the klezmorim. And that got shortened over the course of the 20th century to klezmer music, which is a bit confusing because klezmer music is not a genre. Klezmer music is whatever a klezmer musician plays. And because Yiddish professional musicians were often living in very, very multicultural environments, a klezmer musician, for example, in Poland, would need to play Polish music, Ukrainian music, White Russian music, Yiddish music. Basically, they were the professional wedding and celebration musics, not only for the Jewish communities, but for all of their neighbors as well. So the repertoire of klezmer musicians was very, very broad. It included, let's say, core repertoire that was played by and for Jews. It included the repertoire of their neighbors. And it included also whatever the latest cosmopolitan hits were. So if tango was floating around or if waltz was floating around, klezmer musicians had to be right on top of that because for sure they were going to meet somebody at a wedding who would say to them, "Can you play this waltz?" And they couldn't say no. So this leads to what we call the high school of wedding musicians. They would ask the person, "Well, how does it go?" And most of the times those people couldn't sing, so they go, well, it kind of goes da-da-da-da-da-da, something inarticulate and unintelligible. And the musician would say, oh, yes, I can play that. And then they would somehow have to be able to know enough about music to sort of fake it and understand what was going on.
You're renowned for your contributions to the research, the dissemination, and creative renewal of Jewish music that has manifested itself in many ways and in many, many ensembles, Brave Old World, the Other Europeans, the Zemer Ensemble. But before all of that, do you remember the first time you heard klezmer music?
I do, and I didn't like it.
You didn't like it?
No, I didn't.
Tell us more. Well,
I didn't like it because I came originally from classical piano. And in the 60s, I wanted to move away from very narrative, psychologically dramatic, first-person kind of music. And I wanted to play fiddle music and kind of music of the people, which wasn't so much about individualism, and it was more about sort of collective expression of a culture. But because of the very specific history of Yiddish culture and the role of a klezmer musician, actually, the klezmer clarinet player or the klezmer violinist is called on to be every bit as a soloist as a classical pianist or violinist. So when I first heard it, I was like, oh, this is not really what I'm looking for. But then I realized, like with many things, I encountered a resistance in myself, and I thought, let me see what's on the other side of that resistance. And I kind of went through that door, and a whole world opened up. And really, it's not only the music. I mean, I grew up in a secular Jewish household. I was born in Bloomington, Indiana. My parents spoke Yiddish. But that was really all represented as, a world that was gone, and we weren't looking back and so forth. And I really had no idea when I began to learn Yiddish music, the incredible variety, depth, and breadth, and also contemporary relevance of Yiddish culture.
You mentioned being born in Bloomington, in Indiana.
Yes.
You've since been Berlin-based for the past, few years,
35,
decades.
35
yeah, I was going to
years.
say it's been a while. Laura, let me bring you into the conversation here. How did you connect with Alan?
Well, it was pretty incredible. It was in summer of 2020. I had just become associate dean, and I was working out of my basement because of COVID. And I got a phone call from Micah Burke from the German embassy saying that they would like to partner with a university to allow us to have workshops with Alan Bern. and we could kind of design something that would really work well for our students. So of course I said yes. This is an amazing opportunity for the students and for the school and for all of us to experience music that isn't part of what we usually do at the faculty. And so for 2 years we tried to set something up. At first it was going to be on Zoom. And every time we tried this, there would be a huge outbreak of COVID, and it just wasn't happening. And then I was like, finally, I'm going to bring this man to Winnipeg. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but we're going to figure this out. And everyone that I spoke to about this was so enthusiastic. And I ended up having support from an enormous amount of people. Can I just say all the people that
You sure
helped?
can. Go for it.
So obviously the German embassy, the Des Hôtels Faculty of Music, the Faculty of Arts at the university, the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, the Morrow Institute of Peace and Justice, the Bernie Theatre at the Asper Jewish Community Campus was fantastic. We did a really, really wonderful event there on Sunday. And FinJan, so there's members of FinJan that are playing with our students and have been a big part of this with Alan.
You mentioned just how many people are invested in this project, in this residency, and having Alan here in town. As part of the residency, there's of course has been plenty of music making that's been going on, but also film screenings and public lectures, like you were just alluding to. What's the public response been like thus far?
Well, we've had a whole bunch of events at the university, and at the Faculty of Music, we have a midday recital series that's been going on for decades. It was stopped for 2 years because of COVID, and we're just starting it again. And this was such a wonderful way to start it again because these events brought in people from all over the university, and I think people from outside of the university who wanted to hear what Alan said. And you also did a lecture at Peace and Conflict Studies. And then on Sunday, the event at the Bernie Theatre brought in so many different people who were really hungry to get to know this.
There's one more event that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this conversation. But Alan, I want to talk a little bit more about teaching this music. Sort of as Laura was talking about just a moment ago, this isn't something that's typically taught in a sort of institutional setting in terms of formal training. And I understand that there are a lot of learned techniques in klezmer passed down from generation to generation and then relearned after, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust and the klezmer revival, at which you were at the forefront. I suppose it only makes sense then that you're here in Winnipeg to teach this music person to person, right?
That's right, because for centuries it was orally transmitted, not through written music. And in fact, it's very important to hear the music and not to think of it as, oh, this is like eighth notes but different, because it starts in a different place. I often say, to be provocative, there are no 16th notes in klezmer music, right? And what I don't mean by that there are no fast passages, but there's no reason to think of, if we have a string of fast notes that starts somewhat slower and then gets faster and then there has irregular rhythms in the middle of it and then rushes towards the cadence, there's no reason to think of that as 16/16th notes with a poco a poco accelerando at the beginning and then various fermati written in the end and then, a molto accelerando at the end. This is all laying on top of the concept of perfectly equal quantities, a kind of an expressive intention. But you can skip all of that and start right with the expressive intention. And for people who have learned languages where the way it sounds is quite different from what it looks like, they'll understand that actually sometimes it's better just to skip that step. So you're not thinking, this is an L, but it doesn't sound anything like an L. I have to remember when I see that it's not an L. So just learn the sound. And that's how I'm trying to teach that music here.
And I mean, you're talking about learning the sound and the expression. And, I was thinking about this and listening to a little bit of Brave Old World before you came in and a little bit of FinJan. And so often in the classical world, especially, we think major and minor. And I know that,
Right.
that is kind of reducing, especially when we're talking about klezmer music and Yiddish music. Do you kind of characterize it as almost more modal, like it's not microtonal, but it also is very, do you think of it modally? I know a lot of it also draws on kind of cantorial influence as well and sacred music.
Well, it's not full-on modal in the way that makam or raga is, but it's somewhere between modal music and what we would think of as tonally based music or scale or simply melodically based music. Actually, the intonation in klezmer melodies, we call these things Steger. And Steger comes, like people will recognize this who know the German word steigen. It has to do with mounting steps, with walking up, which is also the origin of the word scale, right? Scala. So often when people hear Yiddish words, they think, oh, this is very exotic. But then I'll say, but what do we call this in standard classical music? That Italian word, what does that mean? Oh, yes, it means exactly the same thing. So let's see, where was I? Remind me of the question again.
I was just talking about major and minor. That was just
Yes,
me
major and
indulging in
minor.
a curiosity.
Major and minor.
You know?
Sorry, I lost the thread there for a second.
Hey, I appreciate it.
So the interesting thing about klezmer modes and about Yiddish culture is that it's positioned really precisely between East and West.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see this in many, many different ways. So especially when we look at Polish Jewish culture, for example, the architecture of synagogues in Poland, you would think, well, if they have to borrow architecture from someone, it should be from Polish architecture. But no, it's borrowed on the one hand from German architecture, which is where they came from, and Turkish architecture, which was the high culture that they were looking east towards. Mm-hmm. So you see in a Polish synagogue, on the one hand, very much Western European elements, and on the other hand, elements from the Middle East. And this is very precisely analogous to what's going on in the music as well. So a mode that I introduced yesterday to the students, which klezmer musicians called Fraigish, is also known throughout the Middle East and throughout the Mediterranean as Hijaz. And Hijaz is a family of modes. It's not just one mode, because what makes it a mode is not just the notes, but also how you use those notes. Mm-hmm. When I play a melody to a colleague from Syria or Iraq or Greece or Turkey that's in Hijaz, they say, oh, yes, we know this melody. We play this melody. We pitch this note a little bit higher. We pitch that note a little bit lower, but it's our scale.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how it all sort of comes together in this music. And I was chatting with our music director, Chris Wolf, about klezmer music and playing klezmer. And one of the ways that he described it, as a clarinetist who played with Chai, a Jewish folk ensemble here in Winnipeg, he said, you know, it always to him felt like the most fun you could have in a minor key. You know,
yes.
It comes down to an expression. Does that sound about right?
I don't think of it as major and minor anymore, right?
Yeah.
But I understand. I mean, it's a very part of the ethos, I think, of Jewish ethos in general, certainly the Eastern European, but maybe all Jewish ethos, is a certain kind of emotional openness. Mm. And in that emotional openness, sadness and joy are both obviously right there. Yeah. You know, and we think about great clowns, for example, you know, and a great clown is someone who can make you cry and the next instant they're making you laugh. And it's partly because they open you up emotionally that way that you can appreciate the full spectrum of what's inside of you. I do think that klezmer music explores the full spectrum of human emotions.
That certainly does. Laura, there's a special midday concert that's coming up tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the students' involvement in this residency?
Absolutely. So because Alan was coming, we decided that we would love to have an opportunity for the students to experience klezmer. Excuse me. And so as part of the chamber music ensemble that the students are part of, we gave everyone the opportunity to be part of this klezmer ensemble for the first term instead of the chamber ensembles they would have been in. And so about 10 students are in this ensemble. And they've met with Alan. You've had 3 rehearsals. And Myron Schultz from Finjan is also there. And yesterday, Danny Kulak was there, right?
Right.
So these students are starting from square one. Most of them have never played from ear, as far as I can tell from what they're saying. And they certainly didn't know this music. And they've gone on such an extraordinary journey with Alan throughout these 2 weeks. And one of the things I was really hoping for in this residency was to open up a door into a world that we don't know and to spur our curiosity and our imagination, and also for the students to discover different things about themselves as musicians because they're making music in a different way. And I would say from what I've seen and what I've heard, that definitely has happened. So they all played at the event on Sunday. And then they got to see this amazing documentary with extraordinary music in it. And I think they could understand that differently because they've started to go through the same process. And tomorrow they're performing about a 20-minute set in one of our midday recitals at the faculty as part of their chamber music ensemble. So the rest of the concert is going to be other groups that have been working throughout the term on different repertoires. And then this group's going to come and play a little klezmer for everyone.
How cool is that?
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question before I let you both go. Alan, you mentored countless young musicians, especially young musicians, but musicians across the world through residencies like this one and intensives like the Yiddish Summer Weimar and other music academy. Where do you see the future of klezmer going?
Well, these days, what started off as the klezmer music revival has turned into something that actually I coined the term for this, New Jewish Music, and then there's even a subset of that called New Yiddish Music, and that is a very, very big tent under which people are finding their identities and developing music, and it's an incredibly creative place. And I see among all of the bands and among the different things happening something that mirrors my own personal path, which is an interesting sort of pendulum movement between being creative with something, trying something out and seeing how can I stretch this, and then you reach the point where you think, I think I need to go back and check out what those old guys were doing again and kind of water the roots a little bit. And you go back into that and you think, oh, yeah, I appreciate this in such a different way now because I made my own original music and now I really hear what they're doing. And now I'm inspired to go back and make some more original music. And then you go back to that part of the pendulum, you think, whoa, I really need to check out again what those old guys are doing. I've gone back and forth on that pendulum hundreds of times, really, in 40 years. And the best musicians do that. We're constantly exploring our creativity, and from that new vantage point, it's like hiking up a mountain. From that new vantage point, you reinspect the places that you've been, and then you say, okay, I understand where I am. You go further, you look back, where have I been? And in fact, that whole dialogue between the past and the future is a very, very important part. It's Jewish culture is utopian, where we are commanded to try to bring about a utopia. So we're very future-oriented, but we're also constantly understanding ourselves and also our relationship to the future through the past. And one of the things that I very much like, before coming here, I was given an award by the German government. And actually, the people in the German embassy here in Ottawa were partly responsible for that. And the last sentence of this award says that my work gives the past a future, or gives memory a future. And I love that phrase because we sometimes think of memory as only looking towards the past. But if you think memory can have a future. So in this way, this is right in the pocket of also early music, which understands itself as historically informed performance practice. And I would say that what I represent in the Yiddish music world is very much like that, historically informed performance practice and beyond.
Well, thank you both for taking the time to come in this morning. It's been great chatting, and it's wonderful to have you here in Winnipeg, Alan.
Thank you. I'm really loving it here.
And great seeing you as always, Laura.
Thank you.